Welcome to Enthusiastical History of the World. In this podcast, I'll share with you a short story from the book Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written by Saint Bede the Venerable, and afterwards talk a little bit about the purpose of history. And so I present to you the story of Dryhthelm, the man who came back from death. At this time a memorable miracle, like to the miracles of old, occurred in Britain, for in order to rouse the living from the depths of the soul, a man, after being for some time dead, rose again to the life of the body and recounted many memorable things which he saw, some of which we will here briefly report, state, and transcribe. There was a householder at the head of a household in a district of Northumbria, which is called Cunningham, living piously with all his house. He was attacked by and suffered from a bodily distemper, and it grew worse daily, till he was brought to death's door and departed at the beginning of the night. But at dawn he revived again and suddenly sat up, and all who sat weeping by his body were stricken with infinite terror and fled out, save his wife only, who loved him best. She alone remained within, though much frightened and trembling. Then he comforted her, and said, "Be not afraid, for truly I have risen from death, and am permitted to live among men once more, yet not as I lived before, but from this time on I must live very differently." And then at once he got up and went to the chapel in the village and remained in prayer till broad daylight. And soon after that he divided all his property into three shares. One he gave to his wife, a second to his children, the third, which fell to him, he distributed on the spot to the poor, and after a short time renounced all worldly things and came to the monastery of Melrose, which is for the most part surrounded by a bend of the river Tweed. And he there entered into God's service and received the tonsure, and proceeded to a retired hermitage, provided for him by the abbot, and there, up to the day of his death, endured and continued in such contrition and continence of mind and body, that men could see that he had witnessed much, both terrible and desirable, that is hidden from others, as his life declared, though his tongue was silent. He reported what he had seen on this wise, and said, "Radiant in face and look, and in bright apparel, was he who guided me." We proceeded in silence, as I thought, and it seemed, towards the northeast quarter of the heavens, where the sun rises at midsummer. And during the time we were going, we arrived at a valley of great breadth and depth and of infinite length, lying on our left. One part was very dreadful, being full of boiling flames; the other was not less intolerable through the chill of hail and snow. Both were full of men's souls, which seemed to be cast to either side in turn, as though by the overpowering violence of a great storm. When they could not endure the force of the excessive heat, they sprang away in their misery into the midst of the excessive cold, and when they could find no rest there, they sprang back into the midst of the burning fire and the unquenchable flame. And while they were tortured with the innumerable crowd of dark spirits, without an interval of any rest in this wretched change, far and wide as could be seen, then I began to think, and supposed it was hell, of which intolerable torments I had often heard stories. Then my guide, who was going before me, answered my thought and thus spoke: "This is not hell, as you conclude and imagine." Now, when I was very much frightened and terrified by this dreadful spectacle, he led me gradually on to a district further on. Then suddenly I saw the parts before us begin to darken, and all filled with a thick darkness. On our entering into this darkness, it gradually became so great and so dense that I could not see anything, only the appearance and robes of my guide were bright and shining. And as we advanced under the shadow of the dark night, there suddenly appeared before us many masses of black flames, rising up as out of a great pit, and again falling back and retiring into the pit. As I was being led there, suddenly my guide disappeared, I knew not where, leaving me in the middle of the darkness and the fearful vision. And while these masses of fire incessantly now shot up on high, now sank down again into the abyss of the pit, I looked and saw that all the points of the ascending flames were full of men's spirits, which, like ashes ascending with smoke, were now cast up on high, now again, as the fiery vapor contracted, slipped back once more to the abyss at the bottom. Also an intolerable foulness steamed up with the fiery vapor, and filled all the place of darkness. When I had stood there for a long time in terror, and knew not what to do, where to go, or what end was coming to me, I suddenly heard behind me a loud sound of violent and piteous weeping, as well as also loud cackling laughter, as if of a rude mob mocking their captive foes. And when the sound came nearer me, I saw a crowd of accursed spirits dragging and bringing into the midst of the darkness 5 men's souls, lamenting and mourning as they exulted and laughed very much at that. One of these persons was, as far as I could perceive, a tonsure priest, one was a layman, one was a woman. The accursed spirits dragged them on and sank down with them into the middle of the abyss of burning flame. When they had sunk far, and I could not clearly distinguish the cries of the men and the laughter of the devils, yet I still had in my ears the mingled sound. Meanwhile there rose up some of the dark spirits out of the abyss and place of torment, and encompassed me. They had fiery eyes, and blew foul fire out of mouth and nostrils, and they held in their hands fiery tongues, and they beset me, and threatened to seize me with them and hurl me into destruction. And though they thus terrified and frightened me, still they durst not touch me, while I was encompassed on all sides by my foes, and enclosed from without by the blind darkness. Then I lifted up my eyes and looked hither and thither, to see whether any help was coming, that I might be saved. Then there appeared to me along the road, on which I had before come, as it were a bright shining star amid the darkness. Then this light grew greater and greater, and hastened quickly to me, and when it came near me, all the accursed spirits dispersed and fled away, which had previously threatened me with their tongues. It was my guide who had conducted me. Then he at once turned to the right, and began to lead me southeast, to the quarter where the sun rises in winter. Then we were soon carried out of the darkness, and he led me into fair serene light. After he had led me into the open night, I saw before us a very great wall, of whose length on either hand and height no end was visible. Then I began to wonder why we were advancing to the wall, as I could not see in it any door, nor any ascent anywhere on either side. When we had come up to the wall, then at once, I know not how it was so ordered, we found ourselves above on the top of the wall. And then I saw there a plain, most spacious and most fair, and it was all full of one sweetness of springing blossoms, and the wondrous sweetness of the strong scent at once drove away all the foulness of the foul and dark furnace which had pervaded me, and a light and radiance so strong streamed throughout the whole place that it seemed brighter than the brightness of the whole day, or of the beams of the midday sun. In this plain were countless gatherings of men, white and fair, and many an assemblage of hosts, rejoicing and exulting. As he led me there amid the bands of those blessed hosts, I began to wonder, and I thought perhaps this was the kingdom of heaven, which I had often heard spoken of. Then he answered my thought and said, "This is not," said he, "the kingdom of heaven, as you conclude and suppose." As we were passing on, and had got beyond the mentions of the blessed spirits, I saw before us a much more gracious light and brightness than I had seen before, in which I also heard voices most sweet of those that sang God's praise. Also from that place there issued such sweetness of wondrous odor, that the sweetness which I had before experienced and had thought so great, seemed but slight and moderate in comparison with the succeeding light and brightness. Also the light and brightness of the blossoming plain seemed but moderate in the delight of that place. When I supposed we should have gone in, then suddenly my guide halted, and without delay retraced his steps, and led me back by the same road on which we had come before. When on our way back we came to the joyous mentions of the white and fair spirits, he said to me, "Do you know what all these things are, which you have seen and beheld?" I answered him, "No," said I know them not." He said, "The place where the valley was, which you saw to be terrible through boiling flame and violent cold, is the place in which are to be tried and cleansed the souls of men, who delayed to confess and atone for the sin and wickedness which they did, and yet at last, in the very hour of death, fled to repentance, and so passed away from the body. These, however, because they confessed and repented at the moment of death, attain at doomsday to the kingdom of heaven, and many too are aided by the supplications and prayers of living men, by their alms and fasting, and above all by celebration of Mass, so that they are rescued before doomsday. And know that the pit which foamed up with flame and was so foul, which you saw, was the mouth of hell's torment, and whatever man at any time falls into it is never rescued from it throughout eternity. Then the place covered with blossoms, in which you saw that fairest host shining without and taking their delight, is the place in which are received the souls of the just, who depart from the body while doing good works, and yet are not so perfect as to be led at once into the kingdom of heaven. Yet all these at doomsday attain to the vision of Christ, and the joy of the heavenly kingdom. For as many as are perfect in every word, deed, and thought, immediately on issuing from the body attain to the heavenly kingdom. To its neighborhood belongs the place where you heard the sound of the pleasant song accompanying the odor of sweetness, and saw the brightness of the great light. But you, however, as you are now to return to the body and live again among men, if you will zealously maintain in righteousness and innocency your conduct, your character, and your words, then you will receive after that your place of habitation among the exultant hosts of the blessed spirits, which you but now saw and beheld last of all. And know also that when I left you for a time, I did so to inquire and know what should be done about you. When he said to me that I should return again to the body, I marveled much and detested it, and the thought was hateful, for I found pleasure in the sweetness and beauty of the place which I had seen there, and at the same time in the enjoyment of the society and bliss of those I saw in the place. And yet I did not dare to make any request of my guide. And now amid all this, I know not how it was so ordered, I see myself now living among men. These things and others too, which the men of God saw, he will not tell to all everywhere, if slothful and careless in their life, but only to those who either were afraid out of dread of torment, or rejoiced in hope of eternal joy and bliss, will he make known and relate these matters out of love of piety. There was a monk and priest living in the neighborhood of his hut, whose name was Hamgels, and whose good deeds were on an equality with his sacred rank. He afterwards, in Ireland, as a hermit, supported the last years of his life with a little bread and cold water. At that time he often visited the men, and by his earnest questions learned from him what he had seen, when he was divested of the body. By his disclosures and statements also the few particulars we have set down here came to our knowledge. He also related his vision to King Alfred, who was excellently trained in holy prayers, and he was heard by him with such pleasure and earnestness that at the king's request he was taken into the aforesaid monastery and received tonsure as a monk. And whenever the king came into that part of the country, he repeatedly visited him to hear his words and his story. In this monastery at that time there was an abbot and a priest of pious and modest life, named Ethelwald, who afterwards filled and held the bishop's seat of the church at Lindisfarne with a conduct worthy of his rank. In this monastery the men of God received a retired dwelling place, that he might there freely obey and serve his Creator in continual prayer. And because this place lay on the bank of the river, it was his wont, out of great love for bodily purification often, to enter the stream, and there to continue in psalms, singing and in prayer, remaining unmoved, at times standing up to his waist, at times up to his neck, and he plunged his body and dived in the river, as long as it seemed he could endure. And when he came out on land, he never would lay aside his wet and cold garments, till they grew warm and dry from his own body. When in midwinter, as the pieces of half-broken ice flowed about him, which he himself often broke up and crushed that he might have a place in the river to stand, or to plunge himself in, men who saw it said to him, "Well, that is a marvel, brother Dryhthelm," this was the man's name, "that you can at all endure such a great severity of cold." He replied simply, for he was a man of simple sense and modest nature, and said, "I have seen colder." And when they said, "It is a wonder that you choose such severe and hard asceticism," he answered them, "I have seen what is harder and severer." And so he, up to the day of his summons from earth, with unvarying desire for heavenly blessings, and with daily fasts, exhausted and tamed the old body, and he, by his words and by the example of his life, was the means of salvation to many. The end. Quite a fascinating story, isn't it? A man coming back from death, and sharing the wisdom he gained from that journey with those who he deems worthy of the knowledge. But it is not only the story itself that is fascinating, it's that Bede bothered himself to mention it in his book, which is about the English people and church, mostly the church. I have no reason to doubt that he indeed believed in the events that have allegedly taken place, yet he didn't really have to mention it, considering that most of the book is about bishops and other important Christian men. So why did he do it? Well, he wasn't telling the story of Dryhthelm just to give information about the monk's background, nor was it just because the story itself is interesting. No, he was trying to convey a message. He knew that future generations would read his book, and he wanted them to read this story so that they too would possess the wisdom Dryhthelm shared and live holy lives like him. This motivation becomes quite obvious if you look at what he mentions after sharing this story. That is, another man who was the literal opposite of Dryhelm and hence doomed. And I think this tells a lot about the history writing tradition. He knew his work would not be lost. He knew that learned people would read it. Perhaps he couldn't have guessed 1300 years later someone from Turkey, a land so far that he would have only heard about it in the Bible, would read and talk about it, but he knew that someone in the future would read and hopefully be influenced by it. And I think that is what history is all about. History is not about which battle had taken place in which year between which kings, but rather about why it happened and what were the consequences. It is not about who was Drythelm, when was he born, or how rich he was. No, it is about what kind of man was he, and what can we learn from his story. Bede mentions that Drythelm divided all his belongings to three, and shared between his wife, his children, and the poor. But he doesn't tell how much he had, or how many children did he father, because it isn't the point. The whole point of history is to learn from our past, to know what happened and why did it happen and what kind of lessons are there, patiently waiting for us to take them, to learn from them. History is something that we should be enthusiastic about because the ones who wrote it did so with passion. They themselves were enthusiastic about the history. He doesn't tell this story just for the sake of telling it. No, as I said before, he's trying to convey a message. He's trying to educate the generations which would come after him. He's trying to give them a lesson. He's hoping that people who would read him years and years later would learn from him, would learn from what he wrote. And I think that this should be the aim when one is studying history, to learn, because the writers, their main purpose for writing was exactly this. And I think that we should aim for that rather than trying to memorize stuff. We should be trying to understand the message, whether that message be propaganda, which most of the historic writings are, or truth. We should try and understand that message, because that is really the important thing. I mean, I know that you will not believe me when I say this, but if you will just forget how history was taught in school, forget all the dates and names of the tanks and of wars, of rivers and of men, and instead read for yourself and look for lessons to take, you'll find plenty, and you'll be happy to find them. You'll be happy while searching for them. Because I don't know if it's just me, but I think it is crazy that I'm reading something that was written 1300 years ago. When reading, I feel as if I'm having a conversation with the man himself. And I am lost for words when trying to describe how that makes me feel. As I was reading the story just now, I could imagine an old man in his priestly robes, with a white beard, with ink stains on his wrists, sitting on a stool and writing on a yellowish paper. I could hear the sound of his pen moving, his breathing, and the candle that is on the table slowly burning. And I believe you can too. If you have time, please go back to the start of this video again. Get yourself in a comfortable place and listen to the story once again, but this time with your eyes closed. I hope that by doing so, you will understand how wonderful history really is and why you should be enthusiastic about it. And that is all, ladies and gentlemen, for today's podcast. I hope that you've enjoyed, and I hope that it was useful for you. I'm hoping that you could learn something. I tried to convey a message just like Beat did with his story. And I hope that I was at least partially successful at that. And please pardon me for bad pronunciation or any grammar mistakes, if I've made any, which I probably did, since I'm not a native speaker of this tongue. Matter of fact, it's a Indo-Aryan language, and my native language isn't even in the same group, so it's kind of hard for me. I'm trying my best, but there could have been mistakes. There probably are a lot of mistakes. I hope that you can overlook them. If there were any parts that you couldn't understand due to bad pronunciation or bad sound quality, because I'm doing this for the first time, I apologize again. And you can find the transcribed version of this podcast in the video description, so you could just read from there if you wish. And please, I'll be most gracious if you are kind enough to leave feedback. And yeah, that's all. Thank you for tuning in. And until next time, goodbye.